Hey everyone, welcome to SumZero. Today we've got a fascinating discussion on tap. We have the CEO of Spire Global here. Stock exchange ticker is SPIR, along with Ben Hackman, who's their head of IR. We're going to be talking about sort of space as a service. Peter, I've heard you describe Spire as sort of an AWS for space, which is quite a provocative way to encapsulate the business. But I think one that will hopefully resonate with everyone on the call and anyone kind of watching this. Just as a quick high level, do you want to maybe explain what you mean by that?
Sure. We laid out, here a few slides, but literally what Spire does is it allows our customers to have a space business, a space operation in a matter of days, weeks, or months, depending if it is a piece of software or if it is a piece of hardware, and leverage our full infrastructure and just get an API to the resulting data. Exactly the same way as you could now launch an internet business in a matter of days, weeks, or months, just leveraging Amazon AWS or Google GCP or Cloud or Azure to leverage someone else's infrastructure to run your business on it, because you don't have to figure out all of the licensing and building and software stack and everything else that is required to build that. And I hope everyone will believe me when I say putting up a constellation in space and a ground station network is just a little bit more complicated than building a data center, which indeed is complicated enough already.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's actually dive into that a little bit. One of the reasons why I think a lot of investors like AWS from an investment standpoint are that there are significant barriers to entry, and there's a certain scale advantage that Amazon has with offering, online storage and all the variety of AI tools that they've put on the cloud. You mentioned the data center build out and infrastructure that not only powers their clients but powers them as well. In sort of thinking through the real barriers to entry in your business, can you just describe what it takes or what it's taken Spire to build out this constellation? From what I understand, you guys have around 100 nano satellites floating around the Earth. But just try to maybe walk us through what's involved here and what kind of helps you guys, I think, create an enduring business that will last a long time.
So our best estimate is still that someone with unlimited amount of funds would take somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5 years to replicate where Spire is from a technology and deployment perspective, which doesn't say anything about the customer acquisition that we have, the customer presentation, the customer relationships that we have, which for larger customers that now have 7- and 8-figure and higher contracts with us is a process of many years, as I think is apparent for anyone who ever has sold to large corporations or to the government. There's multiple layers that create that enduring moat that we have. The first one is the base technology that we have in space. The unique thing about space is that you cannot replicate it on Earth. And it is a pretty harsh and an unforgiving and difficult environment. And so without the ability to test it definitively on the ground, the only way for you to really learn and improve and build your technology is actually going to space. And we all have heard the stories of NASA missions, billions of dollars missions that then go up there. And, one of the more favorite ones is Hubble, of course, where, they launched it after, I think it was about a decade of build time. It was a multi-billion-dollar price tag. And then it turned out that it had a bit of a looking problem, right? It literally was half blind. And we had to send in, contact lenses in a very, very costly repair mission, because you cannot test on Earth how something will operate in space. So the first thing is literally the technology that we have built that operates in space and the accumulated heritage that we have on technology, which is a few hundred years, somewhere between 350 and 450 years at this point in time. The next layer is then the actual payloads that is collecting the data. And to give people a sense of how tricky it is to build such a sensitive radio frequency wave detection or listening payload, our now big friends at NASA, when we started out, said, Peter, I understand you are a high energy and fusion physicist, but you will have to break some laws of physics to make it work of what you're telling that you will do. So there was certainly a large amount of skepticism about the viability from a technology perspective. If this actually can be done of what today we do at very, very large scale. And it is something that you can't buy. Neither the space heritage of like our satellite technology is something that you can buy. It's all in-house developed and built, nor that payload hardware IP or software IP that drives that payload is something that you can buy. So that's kind of like the first layer. The next layer is the analytics layer. As you might recall, we have built the company from day one to capture the full value chain, from the creation of the clean data to adding analytics, to adding predictions, to building full solutions. And some of those analytics pieces require quite esoteric skill sets. We're not talking, Python and Java and some image analysis, which, my almost teenage daughter is starting to do. We are looking at radio frequency wave optics. We're looking at GNSSR. We're looking at Fortran. We're looking at metrology. We're looking at the post-processing of numerical weather prediction output. Those are skill sets that are very, very scarce. And so accumulating the skill set and then building the technology on top of it, the analysis, as well as the predictive analytics on top of it, is another layer that requires not just money, but also time. The third layer then is the actual data. As everyone who runs a data business knows, the more unique data you collect, the larger your moat becomes. The way Spire has been set up as a business is that we collect data that is only and exclusively available if you have a large satellite constellation of our kind. Now, no one ever had a satellite constellation of our kind ever in the history of mankind collecting this type of data. And no one still does today other than Spire. So we are collecting truly unique data points at a scale that no one else has, and feeding millions and hundreds of millions of data points into our data vault that then informs our machine learning and AI training models. Something that, just like any other data business, augments our moat every single day. The next layer then is simply the scale of the deployment. It is the scale of the constellation, over 100 satellites, and it's a scale of ground stations, 16 countries, 32 locations, 70 antennas. There is a deployment schedule and a deployment logistics problem involved in rolling something out of that scale that only very, very few companies, you need less than one hand to count it on, have ever been able to accomplish. And then the last one is the licensing aspect. You do need licenses to communicate with your spacecraft, and you do need licenses for your ground stations to operate. And those licenses are granted by local regulators. Now, we have licenses from about 20 different regulatory regimes, and some of those licenses take a number of months to acquire, but some of them actually take years. Independently how much money you spend, it takes years to acquire those licenses. So you take all of that together, the invention of technology that you can't buy, the building of analytics software that, again, you can't buy, but requires very, very scarce resources. The data that gets communicated and collected on a daily basis, the scale of the rollout and the licensing, you end up with something that is not just money, but it's actually time between us and anyone trying to replicate it. And then you need to add on top of that the customer relationships that we have built over now a number of years, and the high retention rate showing the strength of those relationships that we have as those customers not just buy from us, but keep on buying from us with as of our last quarter, a net retention rate of 135%.
So the other, I guess, characteristic of the AWS analogy that I think is interesting is, one of the reasons why Amazon became so popular, especially amongst, even smaller tech companies like ours, is that Amazon made it, it made access to cloud tools affordable. And so from a cost standpoint, I'm curious what, you have these 4 different verticals, right? The maritime, earth, air, and I forget the last one. I'm blanking on it. But
maritime, aviation, weather, and space services.
Okay, right. So space service is the last one. How are these contracts priced? Like, what does the typical contract look like, both from a size standpoint, also a duration standpoint, and how would you expect the dynamics of those terms to change as you end up scaling the business, deploying more satellites, expanding the services, potentially expanding verticals?
So there's a couple of really rich tidbits in your question. So thank you for offering that. The first one is actually about the scale of the constellation. One of the very unique things about Spire is that we have built a business of collect data once, sell it an unlimited amount of times. And that's a bit unique. We don't sell capacity in any shape or form, be that a pointing as you do with looking satellites, or a bandwidth as you do with talking satellites. We truly collect the data once, and then we sell it an quasi unlimited amount of times, making it truly equivalent to any other data or a software as a service business that people might have seen. So that's kind of like the first element. The second element is that we don't plan, hence, to scale our constellation. The coverage that we have over Earth already today is quite exceptional. Others might talk about being able to acquire data on every few days, maybe even on a daily basis, covering most of Earth. Spire covers all of Earth every 15 minutes, 100 times a day. And so from a constellation scale perspective, we are actually very happy with what we have today. And we don't need to build and spend money to make a constellation larger to keep on scaling our revenue. Now, when we talk about the individual businesses and their contracts, they do vary a little bit by size, depending on the customer type, as well as the solution type, right? Some of our contracts start as low as mid to high 5 figures, but we have contracts that, by the extensiveness of their data, their rights, their resources, are 8-figure contracts. So it is a pretty broad spectrum of levels of engagements that customers have with us, and they very often start more in the 5-figure or 6-figure scale, and then over time, as we continue to solve use cases for them, grow into the high 6 figures, the 7 figures, and above.
The last
sorry, you one last point on your question. I don't want to miss that one. You asked about the contract duration. We do have a number of 1-year contracts with an auto renewal, but we also have 4- and 5-year contracts. Over across our whole portfolio, the average length of our contract is a little bit over 2 years.
Got it. One of the things I've seen, you've mentioned a TAM of around 200,000 customers, and I think the last figure I saw was that you currently have around 600. Is that roughly correct? 700 customers. Okay. Kind of getting from that 700 to 7,000 or 70,000 or 200,000. What would you say are the biggest bottlenecks, or is it just kind of sales and marketing? Is it cost? Is it something else? Like, is it competition? Like, where do you see kind of the trajectory in terms of just pure customer growth?
I'm fairly certain that what I'm about to say applies to us the same way as it applies to your business. It's people. Finding the right people, right culture, right mindset, right education and experience at the right point in time to drive your business. It's literally sales and marketing, and to a lesser degree on the product side. And I think that's, it's probably hard for you to find a CEO on this on such a podcast to say that people is not a problem or not a bottleneck. So in that sense, again, very similar to traditional businesses.
Yeah.
The market is vast. The product market fit is very, very high. I mean, we've grown from 1 million of recurring revenue to just about 100 million of recurring revenue, 98 as of end of Q3, in 5 years. There is literally just a handful of companies, like one handful of companies that have grown that quickly their product. And you don't get that unless you have very, very clear need and demand on the customer side. So it is finding the right people in the right time scale, bringing them on board while keeping a strong, positive, mission-driven culture. That is the bottleneck. That's where we're investing.
And right now, are you seeing kind of more of a, an inbound sales pipeline, or do your sales folks proactively reach out to governments and corporations, or are they so busy with existing leads, just kind of companies coming to you guys because of the unique data set that it's really more about, nurturing those relationships that are inbound?
It's both. It literally is both. And I honestly admit, I don't know the exact split statistics right now. I know that a little while ago, it was pretty much 50-50.
Yeah.
We certainly have not yet the level of awareness that we would like to have. The number one, feedback or question that we hear from customers in a first conversation is, really? You can do that? I didn't know you can do that. I didn't know this existed. So there certainly is still a gap between the capabilities that Spire has and the solutions that we can offer to customers in a broad range of industries, and an awareness in those industries and customers that that solution exists and is available to them at a cost and time scale that is just very, very different. It's not unlike the 90s maybe, or the early 2000s, when the concept that a company would have their own computer network or their own computers on every employee's desk was still a bit novel, especially in the 90s, when a computer was like something that filled, a whole room, and generally was used, by the military and maybe some big government organization, but not something that a small company of 50 or 100 people would have any chance of really getting access to. We're in exactly the same situation with how accessible it is for companies to get access to space to solve problems right here on Earth. And we have customers that are as little as like 50 people that provide as service, leveraging space to a pretty large customer base, because that Amazon AWS for space model that Spire has.
What is your fastest growing customer segment right now?
I honestly can't tell you. It's every single one of our businesses is contributing to our high double, low triple digit growth, because all of them are growing with those numbers. We are in a, I would say, like in a fortunate or unfortunate position for the world, but that there are global trends that drive customer demand for us in just about every segment. Probably some of you have thought about global supply chain. Well, we track every single ship and every single plane. That's just about everything which is intercontinental supply chain, right? Some over 90% of global trade happens on the ocean, right? Clearly global security is another massive trend where Spire has contributed, substantially to the customer segment. Climate change is thankfully becoming a theme for more and more people, more and more companies. And Spire has unique capabilities and tools with regards to the impact of climate change might have through weather by predicting it further out and more accurately and with more relevant information, touching a whole host of industries. Again, supply chain being one of them, but you got like shipping and you got flying and you got energy production, you got renewable energy, and you got insurance. and you got agriculture, right? And so there's like this whole host of industries. Every single one of them is actually measured in trillions of dollars and not just hundreds of billions of dollars, that gets impacted by the weather and is more interested in reducing the cost and operational impact from bad weather or inaccurate weather predictions. So there is a number of global trends that all drive our individual businesses, and we get to benefit from them, including the one that you started us off with, Amazon AWS for space, our space services business, because the investment in space, the company creation in space, and the usage of space by an ever larger number of company increases at a very high exponential rate every single year.
Would you say that the macro kind of malaise right now, you mentioned supply chain, but just inflation in general, like, is that a benefit for you guys in some sense, or are you seeing any impact at all from macro headwinds, rates rising and all that, outside of raising capital, but just kind of in terms of the fundamental business?
Yeah. So, thankfully we don't need to raise capital. Last quarter we talked about our growth rate being, over 100%. So I would say that the macro environment has been balanced for us, right? The one area where we did see an impact, and we talked about in an earnings call, is on the exchange rate, right? We have a meaningful business outside of the US dollar. And certainly the change in exchange rate of non-US currencies relative to the US dollar had a negative impact on a US dollar reporting basis, but not necessarily from an underlying activity basis. We've seen time and time again that during even difficult times, the stuff that Spire does for our customers is so well matched to the core of their business that we don't lose them. Even in very difficult times, they don't turn off the subscription to us. And for example, in the early days of COVID, the only time we lost customers is when they literally went bankrupt. Other than that, they used our data, and on the margin used more of our data and solutions to digitize their business more and reduce costs.
Yeah. So when you calculate your retention rate, what math are you running there? You're taking kind of existing customers.
You take a cohort and the dollars, the converted into dollar figure that they spent with you 12 months ago, and you compare it to the into dollars converted amount of money that those same customers spend with you today.
And that was 135% or thereabouts?
That is correct, yeah, for Q3.
That's impressive. What is I'm just curious, you mentioned that you don't actually need more satellites to sort of achieve scale in terms of providing the data that you're offering. What's the shelf life of these satellites? Do you have to replace them every year, every couple of years, every couple of months? What does that look like?
Yeah, so very similar to like the electronic devices that we use on an everyday basis, computer, laptops, cell phones. We write them off after 3 years, and we keep on using them, right? I mean, we have devices that had been on operation for 7 years. Anyone on this call who still has to use a laptop that is 7 years old, give me the number of your boss. I'm going to have a conversation with her. Because I know you're suffering every single day if you have to use a laptop which is 7 years old. Technology continues to improve for our capabilities about 10x every 5 years. And after about 3 years, if you plot that curve, you see that you're sitting right at that need. So it makes it very, very advantageous to replace things after about 3 years. And so we are spending for our data business about $10 to $12 million a year on refreshing and keeping that network modern and up to date, and with the best capabilities. And just by that refreshment money, we not just keep that same network, we actually improve it alongside the 10x every 5-year curve.
So, the 10x you're talking about, like, what does that practically mean? Is that kind of just higher resolution data on where a ship is in the middle of the ocean?
Yeah. It's better data. It's better data. It is more data. It's different types of data. It is more accurate data. Those are kind of like the key stories that happen, because the device as a whole, the individual elements of the device, all get better on a regular basis. And that is driven by the hardware changes. I mean, as you know, we had built a software-defined capability. So we actually don't have a step function, right? There's flat capability, and then when you replace them, you go up a 10x. No, what we do actually, we get to like creep along that curve pretty well, because we do software upgrades to our devices on orbit on a regular basis that change, same thing, amount of data, type of data, accuracy of data, what you can do with the data by running computations and analytics on the spacecraft rather than doing it on the ground. So all of those kind of things, by upgrading them via software, we keep increasing the value of those devices on orbit. But nonetheless, we can't beat with software that upgrade curve on the hardware side. Yeah. So after about 3 years, we write them off and we start replacing them.
It sounds a little bit like the Tesla over-the-air updates. In terms of,
that's exactly right. You want to go a little bit faster, just pay me a little bit extra money and I do an over-the-air upgrade to your Tesla and you can go faster.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And then on the device itself, maybe this is a little too technical, but what is I mean, it's just a radio frequency sensing satellite of some kind, right? Like, do you make the sensors themselves, or
So everything is built in-house, is invented in-house, because you can't buy it. Radio frequency devices, the design of them is called the dark arts of electrical engineering, because it's just very, very sensitive. Like, you can literally build a device and then you take a component and you unplug it and you plug it back in, and the whole capability of this chain just has changed if you don't design it well. So it's very, very detailed, very, very sophisticated, very, very sensitive of how you build those RF sensing devices that then have to operate in space after being shook by a rocket at 6 Gs in 3 different dimensions, and then being exposed to like a pretty harsh environment while they're up there. So yeah, everything is built in-house. You can't buy it. We had to invent it. And some of those, as I mentioned earlier, very, very knowledgeable people said that we'll have to break some laws of physics to make it work at that scale, at that cost, at that size. And all the credit goes to just incredible engineers that have built those devices at Spire and built them every single day. There truly are just a handful of, in every single one of those disciplines, of those individuals anywhere on Earth. We have gone literally hunting for them by reading the paper or the 2 papers that have been written about a particular methodology. And then we found the 2 key lead authors and we were able to hire one of them. It's the second layer that I talked about, is some very esoteric software that had to be written, both on the collection side as well as on the analytics side, as well as on the prediction side, where the skill set required to write that pieces of software is just very, very scarce.
What would you say is your biggest existential threat? Be it a country or a government or another corporation, what would you say kind of keeps you up at night?
Well, I can tell you what keeps me up at night. I don't think it's an existential threat. I mean, when you talk about the biggest existential threat, I would have to say, climate change, right? I have 2 little kids, and I see climate change as a true existential threat for humanity. I think somehow I'm gonna survive. I only need another 40 years or so. But they need another 100. My youngest one is 3 years old, and 2122. That's a difficult year to get to, from a climate change perspective. So I consider that a true existential threat, followed by global war, right? I think we've gotten. I come from a country that lived through World War II. In my parents' house, we used to have a book with a bomb splinter in it. My dad used to tell us stories of the house being bombed, and he was spending most of his years during those times in the bomb shelter, and having limited high school education. So we had war right on our doorsteps, and it's certainly something that is part of my memory. And so what has been happening in Europe, some of the stuff that we talk about in Asia, again, if we talk longer time frames, I do consider a very, very bad global war and existential threats for us. None of that truly keeps me up at night running the business on a day-to-day or even year-to-year basis, I would say. But people, managing people, keeping them aligned, finding the right ones, growing that at the right pace, increasing the efficiency, the collaboration, the overall engagement level and alignment of everyone, all the way up and down the organization. That is, in 8 different offices in 4 countries. That does keep me up at night.
So just to shift gears a little bit, there's been, I think, kind of a trend in the technology industry overall, being the most impacted by the Fed's kind of rate hikes and just cost of capital going up. Tech has largely either frozen hiring or you've seen a lot of layoffs. I think I was reading an article, there was something like 120,000 layoffs in tech over the last couple of months. You guys are obviously growing a lot. You're obviously not in that category, but I think even for businesses that aren't firing folks, profitability has become more important near-term goal. And so I'm just curious what your view is on just how you're managing your cash balances relative to your growth targets, and what you would realistically set as a target for, or at least break even, looking at the next 12 to 18 months or so.
So I always say that, I'm originally from Austria. You can take the European out of Europe, but you can't take Europe out of the European. And we Europeans always have these strange notions that companies should actually make money. Even though I spent 10 years as a quantitative investment manager on Wall Street, I watched aghast how companies can be celebrated for producing high growth rates and billions of dollars of revenue, but spending billions of dollars of cash every single quarter. It never really made that much sense to me. And so we as a company have always been built and designed from day one for operational leverage. Just to give you one tidbit here, when we thought about our satellite constellation, I was obsessed with the notion of asset utilization. How can I make the most out of those assets once I have spent the money deploying that? And so Spire has an asset utilization of 100% or more, depending on how you want to count it, because those devices truly generate value every single second of every single day, collecting data anywhere on planet Earth that we can then sell multiple times. Now compare that with internet bandwidth satellites. You have about 95% of the world's population living on 3% of the world's surface area. So that means those devices are doing their thing for 3%, let's be generous, 5% of the time. Because the other percent, there are no people, there is no one to talk to, so to speak. So you get an asset utilization of at most 5% if they work 100% using all of their bandwidth at any single point in time, anywhere they are on Earth, which is a really, really tall order. So when you then think about it, you got an asset utilization of 5%, and you need, depending on how you want to calculate this, a few hundred satellites, call it, 250 satellites, to provide a service all across the earth of like telecommunication. But you need effective 250 satellites because you got 5% asset utilization. 20 times 250 is 5,000 satellites. That's the reason why those telecommunication constellations are thousands of satellites, because the asset utilization of every single individual one you launch is just, call it 5%. So we have been from day one obsessed with metrics like this. And so when we went public, very shortly thereafter, we said, okay, the company has a pathway to be free cash flow profitable, not even EBITDA profitable, not operating margin, free cash flow profitable, which now has matured to 16 to 22 months. And we have been tracking that, and we have been announcing that, I don't know, Ben, I think since the beginning of the year or so, we have been announcing those dates, and we have been carrying that forward and reiterating that guidance, every single month, way before suddenly the world woke up in the middle of this year and says like, hey, what about this profitability thing? And it's a little bit similar to, you and I went through that in the 90s when, it was all about eyeballs. And then suddenly someone said, yeah, but there is this other thing called cash. And wouldn't that also be nice? And in the end, you had companies that had to focus on how do we actually generate cash from those eyeballs that are today the giants that we all admire. And so clear plan communicated long before it actually became really, really hot. As of right now, it is 16 to 22 months to be free cash flow positive. Everyone can look at our statistics. All of our margins have a very strong upward and to the right trajectory, improving 50 percentage points, 60, 70, 80 percentage points year over year. Everyone can see that, everyone can follow that, and probably figure them out by themselves, given our guidance for the end of this year and the free cash flow profitability when EBITDA profitability and operating margin profitability is most likely to occur.
Do you have kind of a long run, steady state margin target?
Yeah, absolutely. And those numbers just as well as I do. Spire is a classic data analytics business, right? We collect data once and we sell it an unlimited amount of times. We provide analytics on it. We provide predictions on it, all the way to solutions. I got a fixed cost infrastructure to produce that type of service. And I have an Amazon AWS type business, right? Where there's an infrastructure that people can rent. And if I have so many renters that I need to build some extra data centers, so I can do that, right? So the margins that everyone looks at from a gross margin perspective for businesses that are, SaaS businesses or data analytics businesses is exactly how we look at our business. And I think we are on a very, very clear and strong trajectory to that. The big advantage that we have is that our sales and marketing cost is a tiny fraction of what typical software companies have, right? If you think about it, a typical SaaS company, they show up at a big house in a big party, loud music, lots of people, everyone is trying to sell something, and you spend an enormous amount of money to get across to people because it's so loud and noisy. And it's really hard to differentiate how your payment service business is like a better solution than their payment service business, right? We don't face that situation. Yes, we go to a huge, massive house, but it's very quiet. Maybe there is a little bit of Bach playing in the corner, and there's rooms that are filled with about 200,000 people, and we walk into them, and in almost all of the rooms, we are just about the only one which has something that we can give you that is not a PowerPoint.
Got it.
Very different cost structure from a sales and marketing perspective.
Yeah, I totally hear that. In terms of the stock itself, I mean, obviously it's been a disappointing run. I mean, for a lot of companies, not just you guys. Outside of macro, and what would you say has been the biggest sort of insight that investors have missed? Like, what if there was one thing that you feel like people just do not understand about the company, What is that?
If I say space to you, what immediately pictures do you get in your mind? Tell me.
I mean, I feel like I'm looking at it right now on the back of your screen.
You look,
a lot of darkness with some
yeah. What else?
lights interspersed. Yeah.
What else?
I mean, I just think of the unknown. I don't know.
Yeah. You think of the unknown. Do you like, maybe see a rocket?
Yeah, and of course, I think of this. It's just right now, at least, because of Bezos and SpaceX and like there is a certain and even like Kathy Wood, I think she had launched a space ETF not too long ago. There is this like appeal to it. There's a certain sex appeal to it, but it is very much more affiliated with like something that's very far out into the future, like humans going to space as opposed to today's applications of space tech. And I think there's some disconnect there, but that's just me kind of reflecting on my own, sort of exposure to the sector.
I think you're very, very close, right? First of all, it feels something which is far away, right, and not near term, right? And I think that already creates like the first difficulty for all space companies relative to electric cars, right? Because they're like, right here and you can picture them, right? But even if one were to get over this, space is far away and, I don't know what it has to do with Earth. When they think of space, they think of either rockets or some James Bond movie with spy satellite images, blah, 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 right? So those are kind of like the connections that people make to space. I'm very certain that not a single person thinks of radio waves tracking climate change. And not a single person, by the way, I think when they think of space recognizes that if we didn't have space or tomorrow, all of the applications from space were to disappear, no one would get a paycheck. I don't think that is something that people make the connection. There are radio wave applications from space that drive every single transaction that is happening on Earth, from your paycheck to your Uber Eats order to your ATM withdrawal. If those radio wave based applications were not to happen, none of that would exist. So one of the things that Spire has, other than being a space company, which is like, oh, it's far out, it costs much money, don't really have good economics, none of which are factually true. And anyone looking at the economics of the company and our earnings script, we recognize that is just factually wrong. The other thing is that the products that we do are not things that are everyday items that is obvious to people that they associate with space, rockets, and James Bond type of movies and pictures. And that's a communication challenge. I think Ben has done a fantastic job in starting to whittle down that communication of what we do, and we're working on a daily basis on creating better communication, and to say it funnily, decrease the investment opportunity for the broader investment community by closing the gap between price and value that I think Spire represents today.
I mean, on that note, the company's trading at like a 2x sales multiple, or I don't even know if it's that, if it's even that right now, against, as you were saying, 100+% top line growth, with free cash flow potentially a year and a half away. Have you guys ever articulated what the potential upside is here for somebody who's got even a 2-year horizon? Call it, just enough time to let those cash flows accelerate, and where you might start to see some real inflection around margins and sort of the inroads to achieving the type of TAM that you've laid out.
Well, I mean, I don't think that I'm allowed to provide investment advice. My Series 7 expired quite a while ago. But
clear.
But think of it from that perspective of like, okay, there is a pretty solid data set for what are multiples of SaaS companies with reasonable growth rates. Some people make the cutoff between 30% and grow, or some make 40% and grow, or some make it 50%. So pick any of those numbers, and then look over the last 20 years, what has been multiples and how have those multiples evolved over time. And you're going to be hard pressed to find a time period other than the last 12 months or so, where a 30-40% growing SaaS company that is losing money left, right, and center is not trading at a 12 times multiple of ARR, right? With the best companies at the best of times have traded at 100+ multiple of ARR. And so, I think historical data sets up a very, very good framework to look at the company. And then, as you know, the way a stock goes up is there's just two levers, right? One of them is the sales number changes, right? And your multiple stays the same. And the other one is that your multiple changes, right? And I think generally for companies, you have to ask yourself, okay, how is the sales number changing or the profitability number changing? And depending on that growth rate, that gives me an expected annual growth rate for my stock. And then secondly, what is the current multiple and what is possible changes for that multiple, which gives me then an additional lever. If you look at the NASDAQ over the last, I think it's 15 years, for every single percentage point average annual compound growth rate in revenue, the stock went up about 1.7%. So companies that grew 20% compoundingly over 5 years had a stock appreciation that was, in the mid 30s percentage point across the whole NASDAQ kind of like stock market. So I think there is plenty of historical data on the multiple perspective and on the growth perspective for people to say, okay, if I were to follow Warren Buffett and I buy with blood on the street and I sell at the ringing of the peace bells, what is a likely situation here from a multiple perspective, from a compound annual growth perspective through the growth of the company during more normal times, and then make their assessment based on that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Any near-term catalysts outside of earnings that folks should look out for?
Well, if there were, I would definitely not be allowed to share them, as I think is obvious.
Okay, I think that's fair. Anything else that you want to leave us with? This has been an incredible, I think, conversation, and you guys have built an amazing business. It's crazy to be talking to somebody who really is kind of at the forefront, and as close as you are to the future, where we have access to all this information that would never have been possible 10 years ago. But anything you want to leave folks with before we call it?
So I was in Wall Street for 10 years, right? And one sentence that a mentor once explained to me was always stuck with me. The only way to make money in the market is to be right and to disagree with everyone else. If you only do one of the two, you will lose money. And so I think the very unique opportunity for investors here is there is a new segment, and understanding the importance of that segment on the future of planet Earth and the large global trends, global security, climate change, global supply chain, data and analytics that are driving that segment, are probably not well understood at the early innings that we find ourselves in. And that creates, great opportunities to be right and disagree with a number of the people, and then generate good returns, be that for your personal retirement account or for your customers.
Appreciate it, Peter. This has been great. I'm glad you were able to give us so much information over the last 45 minutes or so. But thanks again, and Ben, thanks to you as well for getting that presentation up. So it's too bad we weren't able to flip through it, but maybe we can send it over to our viewers, later this week or something. But thanks again for joining us, guys.